and welcome to Flip the Script Core Session 1, Cold Emails and How to Write Them in a Way that Compels Your Prospect to Respond. My name is Beck Holland. I'm the CEO and founder of Flip the Script. Before we get going into the content here, if you do me a favor and stop what you're doing, go to flipthescript.co and download the deck so that you can follow along at each step of the way. But other than that, let's write some emails, y'all. So first, why don't we start off with a bit of an agenda? As far as the session today, I really wanted to break it down into 4 major buckets. The first bucket, I wanted to start off with how can you pick a reason for outreach? So you see a lot of different debate on LinkedIn on whether you need to go for relevance only or whether you need to pick out something that's personalized about your prospect. But I essentially want to put brackets around and some kind of structure around how can I tease out a personalized premise about my prospect that will make them want to respond and really catch their eye and make you be different. The second bucket, I wanted to go into how can you structure the rest of the email? What are the rules of engagement? What should it look like? How many lines, does it have? And then what is achieved in each one of those lines? The third bucket I wanted to go into is the 7 pillars of attractive messaging. So essentially, what are the different flavors that you want included in your emails? What are the types of things that you want to say to your prospect to maintain consistency, but also make sure that you really have the flavor and you let your reps be themselves within this messaging? And then the fourth and final bucket that we'll finish off with is the 7 deadly sins of messaging. So don't get scared by that title, but essentially it's going to be a big list of things that can deter your prospect from really wanting to respond and take a meeting with you. So why don't we go ahead and jump into bucket 1. So whenever I was a practitioner, which was very recently, a few years ago, whenever I was an SDR, why don't we start there? I remember that I was hitting my numbers and I was exceeding quota, but I wasn't getting really, really great results. And so I remember walking home, from work one day and going into my apartment and laying on the floor and staring at the ceiling and asking myself 2 questions that were the most dangerous questions that I ever asked myself in my career. And I'll ask them to you today. Number 1, do you respond to unpersonalized messaging by taking a meeting with a vendor who is reaching out cold? So for me, that answer was no. I didn't respond to random emails that were coming at me from different vendors ever by taking a meeting. I couldn't think of one time that I did. The second question, and I want you to answer to yourself, but the second question that I asked myself is, do you think your prospects are different than you in that regard? So my answer for that question, unfortunately, or fortunately, depends on how you see it, was also no. So I realized in that moment on my apartment floor in San Francisco that I wasn't responding to unpersonalized messaging by taking a meeting, and I didn't think that my prospects were either. And that posed a problem because most of what I had been taught or most of what I had seen in the industry was all about just relevance in terms of buyer persona or what your product does, but nothing to do with me finitely. So I basically got out an entire list or a big sheet of paper and a purple marker, and I said, what are all the things, hypothetically, if I were to do personalized messaging, that I could personalize on? And I deployed this, the first team that I deployed it with, I had them making, prior to that, 100 cold calls and sending 50 emails per day. And I scaled that all the way back to 10 emails and 20 cold calls per day. And my response rates within 2 weeks were 4x in terms of the meetings that I booked. I then went on to a second company to do that, and I saw 3x. And then I went on to my third company that I was just most recently at, and I saw 6x within the first month for the reps and the results that they were achieving by personalizing their messaging. So I have ranked all of these personalized premises into 5 different buckets of types of things that you can personalize on with your prospect. And I have ranked them in terms of number 1, we're going to start there, is going to be where you're going to get typically or historically based on the data that I've seen, the most response rates. And then we're going to work our way backwards to bucket 5, where you're going to get the least amount of response rates, but still, at least in my experience, higher than just relevant buyer persona templates alone that have no personalization. So there's really 4 types of personalization within the industry. There are 3 out of those 4 the industry would call personalization. The first one that they would call personalization, that I don't consider personalization, is firmographic personalization. So this is anything about a company. So whether that's industry segment, vertical, company size, product sophistication, company funding, etc. Anything about that company that essentially, would trigger someone to do any kind of outreach, but is not personalized to the specific prospect themselves. Second bucket of personalization that I've heard called personalization is going to be technographic personalization. So this is personalization down to what the tech stack that the company has. And then the third and the most often used form of personalization is going to be demographic personalization down to the person's role. So you'll see a lot of this within sales engagement providers of basically they'll say, I'm going to create templates for my 5 different buyer personas, and I'm going to try and send them out relevant messaging without anything that's in specific to them. So the fourth bucket that we're going to go into today is going to be psychographic personalization. So instead of, I'll use my friend Scott Barker, for instance. He is over at Sales Hacker /Outreach. So instead of talking about, Scott's technographic personalization if he uses Outreach and Salesforce within his tech stack, or talking about his role personalization, that he is the head of partnerships, or instead of talking about his firmographic personalization in terms of, where they're at in terms of product sophistication or company funding that they just raised a $50 million round over at Outreach from Salesforce Ventures, we want to talk about Scott in specific. Something he did, something he said, something he liked, and we'll get into the details of that, but basically something about Scott finitely so that it triggers to Scott that not only do we know what company he's a part of, et cetera, and where he's at in the industry and what his role includes, but we have the audacity to know Scott in specific. So this is really when you're going to hook in the types of responses that you want and the volume of responses that you want from your prospect. So let's start off with bucket 1 and we'll work our way backwards into bucket 5. Bucket 1 with the highest response rates, again, historically from what I've seen, is going to be self-authored content. So self-authored content is anything that your prospect authored themselves. Whether that is a webinar that they were a part of, kind of like this one, or not this is a webinar, but close enough, an article that they wrote on LinkedIn or a post that they wrote on LinkedIn, but anything that your prospect basically, really put the effort into and crafted themselves. This is going to get, from what I have seen, anywhere from an 85 to 95% response rate with your prospects. And if I had to guess why, it's because after someone puts their work into their time and effort into something like a webinar or an article or a post, they're really looking for one thing afterwards. After I finish this session, I'm going to walk around the studio here and I'm going to wonder, did you guys think it was relevant? And did you find the content useful? And your prospects are thinking the same thing. So whenever they make a post on LinkedIn, why people love when their posts go viral or when they get likes or when they get comments is because it revalidates to them and confirms to them that what they said was really useful and valid to the marketplace. So we as human beings, that is the main crux of social media, is basically that people like to be validated whenever they say something. So with your prospects, if you're starting to get to know them by reading their work, some article that they wrote or some kind of post that they made on LinkedIn. And I will give the asterisk mark here that with all of these premise buckets, you want to ensure that whatever personalized premise that you're teasing out, that you can then relate back to your product. So be very, very careful of what I would call the 10-80-10 rule, where 10 is personalized, 80% isn't, and 10% is personalized again. You want to make sure that instead of doing that, how that would look like is this. Hi, Beck, I noticed you went to Texas A&M University. We over here at Drift help convert website views into close-won business. How about Wednesday at 2 to talk about that? And what that conveys to your prospect is essentially, yes, I did go to Texas A&M, me and 50,000 other people every single calendar year. What's your point? So it comes off as disingenuous if you're just teasing out a personalized premise and not hooking it. We'll go into that into a later session. But essentially, whenever you're picking out a personalized premise, so whenever you're starting with bucket 1, and if you can find some kind of webinar article that your prospect wrote or post that they wrote, and you can then relate it back into what your product does and get, really creative on how you can do that, then that is the first bucket that I would pick. But always make sure that you're thinking about how can I relate this personalized premise back to what my company does. So that's going to be the highest engagement bucket, is going to be bucket number 1 of anything, again, the webinar that they were a part of, any kind of article that your prospect wrote, or any kind of post that they made on LinkedIn that you can then relate back to your product. Bucket number 2 is going to be engaged content. So engaged content is going to be any kind of content that your prospect engaged with but didn't author themselves. A little less response rate in terms of what you're going to see in bucket 1, because if I had to guess why, it's because in bucket 2, whenever you're talking about something that your prospect engaged with, they're not really the hero because they didn't author the content themselves. However, it's still super strong, and it communicates to your prospect that, again, you went to their LinkedIn profile, you know who they are down to the molecular level, even enough to know what they're doing on LinkedIn. And so it communicates to them that you probably know some kind of way or personalized or relevant reason of how you could hypothetically help them if they were to give you the time. So again, bucket 2 is going to be engaged content, anything that they liked, shared, or commented on, but they didn't author themselves. Bucket 3 is going to be self-identified traits. This is probably my favorite bucket on LinkedIn, because this is going to be a long list of things that your prospect has written about themselves, typically in third person, on LinkedIn. So in bucket number 3, this is, people nowadays are viewing social media, and they're viewing LinkedIn in specific no longer as just a resume. They are viewing it as some place where they can engage with the community, where they can understand what's going on in business, where they can socially listen, and where they can gather some kind of acumen, where they can prospect, where they can get involved with people that they're selling into and people who are selling into them. But when LinkedIn started, that is how they were viewing it, as people were viewing LinkedIn as an online place to store their resume, to where people could go. So because of that nature of it, you're always going to have 3 places where you have a self-identified trait. You have your profile line, your headline, and your company line. These 3, profile line, headline, and company line, all 3, if you sign up for LinkedIn, you're probably going to fill these in. There's usually an About Me section, or maybe it's your role underneath your headline. But these 3 usually are engaged with whenever someone first signs up for LinkedIn. So the reason that I say that is, a lot of you might be sitting at home thinking, like, well, what if I can't find some kind of article? What if I can't find some kind of webinar? And what if my prospects, aren't super active on LinkedIn, and they have all this media engaged content and shared content, or commented content that they've commented on? Bucket 3 is a really, really good option that most people, if they have a profile on LinkedIn, they will have filled these 3 out, but they don't have to be super active on LinkedIn to typically have this. So I sold into a financial buyer, for instance, at one point, and a CIO was one of my buyer personas. And this was a really good bucket for me, because I could tease out the things that they were saying they were interested in, or the things that they were saying that they were talented at within their profile line or their headline. And I could then map that back to what my company did at the time. So these top 3 buckets are going to be where I'm typically having my team source the lion's share of the premises that they're using to reach out, because these are going to be where you're going to get the lion's share of your responses. If I can't find any kind of premise within those first 3 buckets, so they haven't authored any content, my prospect hasn't engaged with any content, and they don't have anything in their company line, headline, or about line in the self-identified traits section, I will then move on to bucket 4. Bucket 4 is going to be what I affectionately call the junk drawer. So this is going to be anything about your prospect that's a little more niche and usually not super business related. So great example, that's listed here: schools attended, personal interests, hobbies. One that I see used a lot is recommendations or skills endorsement. They don't hold a lot of weight on LinkedIn of like, I've never looked at someone and go, oh, they have 50 skills endorsement for a sales team, so they must be really, really good at sales. But this is going to be a bucket of premises that you can use. Again, if you can't find anything in the first three buckets, that's typically non-business related, but the double asterisk mark of whatever you pick, you need to make sure that you can relate back to your product. So if you're going to pick, for instance, for me, that I went to Texas A&M, I used to tell my reps in my last team, you better be able to justify how me going to Texas A&M relates back into your product. So I will never be the arbitrator and the rules girl where I tell you what angle to go. I think that most SDRs and self-prospecting AEs and field reps who are selling into their prospects, they're super creative. So I say, like, take the creativity, run as far as you want to, but these are the rules of engagement. So if you're going to pick something in the junk drawer, just make sure that you're thinking through, like, if they have a personal interest of, let's say they grill, for instance, a lot, then it's like, I need to be thinking through the mechanics of how can I relate grilling back to my product. So, for my, the company that I was just at, for instance, I was just at chorus.ai. I would say to prospects like, hey, Sam, I noticed that you were a grill connoisseur. When it comes to grilling, it's all about the flavors, time, and the pressure that you're on the grill. What if you could diagnose the flavors of your sales conversations that were helping your sales reps close more deals, and bump their quota attainment as a result? So that's kind of a silly one-off example, but basically you get the premise of anything that you pick in bucket 4, you need to make sure that you can relate back to your product. And then the last bucket is going to be bucket 5. This is going to be any kind of company level data. So again, buckets 1 through 4 are going to be where you're going to get your highest responses. Full disclosure for bucket 4, I forgot to mention, bucket 4 is used really, really well with a certain kind of persona. So for instance, marketing typically really likes bucket 4, or sales leaders really liked bucket 4, or SDR leaders really like bucket 4, or HR really likes bucket 4. But if you get into selling into someone in like backend or, CIO or CISO, number one, they don't offer up that much information that regularly, but these little sillier, kind of catchier premises, they tend to shy away from. So if you can't find anything in buckets 1 through 4, I'd go to bucket 5, which is going to be company level detail. My biggest suggestion here is the more detailed, but the more brief that you can be, the better. Sounds like an oxymoron, but give me a second. We have leveraged sales engagement in the sales community to basically want to send out 200 to 300 to 400 to 500 emails a day, because in our brain we're thinking it's all a math game. And instead of sending 50 emails, what if I could send 500? Then I would get 10x the amount of responses. What I'd be careful there, again, with any kind of relevance versus personalization, is once you hit that state of inflection point, as I would call it, of you want to make sure that you're sending out a good quantity of emails, but you also want to make sure that they are all very high quality, because your goal, never forget your goal, is more meetings. So because we have tried to mask and send out 500 emails at once, a lot of different companies that I saw within B2B SaaS specifically, they wanted to start sending out these mass emails, but they wanted to start to make them look personalized so that they could get a response. So a great example is I've seen a lot of templates say like, hey, I noticed that your company is growing, or my CEO passed me your way, or you're within this industry, etc. So it looks somewhat personalized, but it isn't. Because that's a reality within the selling community, you need to make sure that if you're going to take the time to personalize, that you need to spit some kind of detail that you couldn't have known unless you knew exactly who they work for. So the difference between saying, hi, I noticed your company is growing, and I noticed that your company grew 73% over the last 6 months, and you just added a VP of sales and director of sales enablement and a CRO, congratulations. The first email, the former email, I'm not so convinced that you know me. I would actually argue that you probably don't. And the latter email, I'm really convinced that, like, okay, this person took the time to research, they know who I am. So, all the examples are on the board here and in your deck, but any kind of, merger and acquisition with M&A, any kind of posts their company is making, a quick tip there is if you go to any company profile on LinkedIn, they'll usually have an about section. So that can be a meaty place where you can, again, hook back to whatever your company does. any kind of blogs that company is posting, any kind of hiring that they're doing, your website language, but you get the idea. It's anything about the company in specific, a detail that you're saying that you couldn't have sent it to multiple, different people with the same message. So you communicate to your buyer that you know exactly who they are so that they're willing to let you go to the second line. In terms of, we're not going to go too much into all of the sequences. We actually are going to do that in a later session on how to sequence all of this within Outreach. But essentially, my entire playbook from top to bottom is on this slide. So I typically have 15 different sequences that I'm putting together within personalization, and they are shell sequences. So essentially, I am dictating to my reps of like, what kind of scenario are you going to be reaching out? What kind of medium? Is this a cold call? Is this an email? Is this you're sending over a message on LinkedIn? And I'm also doing the list cleaning for them and sending over the people into these sequences. But as far as where the personalization comes in, is I have the shell sequences where it basically, gives them some of the script and gives them some of the structure, but then has a blank for the personalized premise and where they're going to hook it in the middle. But this is the exhaustive deck of all of the different sequences and scenarios that basically I'm putting together within Outreach for the entire breadth of the team. So you'll see there's two buckets here. Bucket number one is going to be premises that I would mention to my prospect. Great example is content downloads, or maybe they attended an event, not right now, but in the future they attend an event, or they registered for a webinar. But basically these are all the sequences, shell sequences that I'm building, where I'm essentially mentioning to them like, hey, this is the scenario, of like, you downloaded some piece of content, and we'll go into how you can hook that into personalization. But you downloaded some piece of content, and so I want to make sure that that is part of the reason of why I'm reaching out. On the other hand side, you have bucket two, where I wouldn't mention the premise of why you're reaching out within this sequence or scenario. There is a number of premises over here, and you could probably take a good guess as to why, but let's take company funding, for instance. I see a lot of different reps reach out to their prospects and say like, hey, I noticed that you just raised $50 million. Congratulations. Do you want to buy my stuff? Because I sell stuff for money, and now you have money. So it communicates to your prospect that in any other case scenario, you didn't really care about them. You only care about them because now they've raised money. Kind of inappropriate, especially if you're trying to strike rapport up with someone that you don't know enough to have a conversation about their business needs and concerns and pain points, etc. So this is going to be an exhaustive list of the things that I typically don't mention, the reason as to why I am reaching out, other than personalization directly to them. Again, we'll go into it in the next slide. But I do use these as a way to sequence prospects that are super high value to me, or maybe there's higher buyer intent. But I'm not mentioning the exact premise of why I'm reaching out, other than personalization down to the psychographic level when I'm talking about them. The difference between the blue and the white, I don't know if anyone is catching on to the color scheme here, but essentially anything in blue is going to be essentially what I call a postbound lead, or a postbound premise. When it comes to marketing, you have three different types of leads, or it comes to the funnel, you have three different types of leads. You have inbound, which is demo request or chat box. You have outbound, which is I'm just reaching out to someone cold. And then you have this whole sneaky category in the middle. And these are people who their buyer readiness is a little bit higher, meaning they know who you are, but they haven't directly become hand raisers yet. I see a lot of people flux between, is this the outbound team's leads, or is this the inbound team's leads? We'll save that conversation for another rainy day, but there is certainly less, they aren't a hand raiser yet, right? So they're not true inbound. So I nicknamed a term, I call it postbound. So it's basically anything in between true inbound and true outbound that's coming over from marketing. So all of those initiatives are going to be labeled in blue. So you've got content downloads, event attendees, webinar registrants, high value MQL. On this side of the ones I wouldn't mention is people who go to your website and view your website. Any kind of dark funnel providers, so G2 is a great instance of that, or 6sense or Bombora. Basically, dark funnel is going to be people who are researching your product on the web but haven't become a hand raiser yet, which on a side note is the lion's share of your buyers. We're doing more research than ever before we talk to a salesperson. Forrester did a study on all of the things that we consider before we reach out to someone to get to know their product directly. We think about we go peer-to-peer first. We call up our friends and we say, hey, are you using outreach or are you using ambition, and how do you like it? Number 2 thing that we consider is influencers within the industry or thought leaders. What are the top people in this field using? What are they saying about that product? And then the third thing is review sites. So essentially, like G2, G2 is a great example of that, where you can see a database of basically the users of that product and what they're saying about the product. So when I go to Nordstrom and I buy a pair of shoes, I typically look in the reviews and I say, like, okay, is this a good pair of shoes? Do these come too tight? Like, what's the quality of leather? But I'm interested in what all the users of this product are saying, because it gives me a good reference point of things I might want to look out for. So the lion's share of our users, if you go 15 variables deep in that Forrester report, the last thing that someone wants to consider before buying your product is a demo. They don't want to talk to any salespeople anymore. They want to do all of the research. The data suggests that they want to do all their research, beforehand, before they reach out to someone who's a salesperson, because they know they're agenda driven. So always compare this to your own experience of whether you like talking to salespeople and whether you want to, when you walk into the Gap, talk to someone about jeans, or whether typically you want them to leave you alone and why you want them to leave you alone. So you're doing more research than ever before, at the onset before you reach out to a salesperson. So dark funnel is a good place where you can pick up those users and understand who is doing research beforehand. Again, it's in the bucket of premises or scenarios and sequences that I wouldn't mention the premise necessarily, but I would still know that, like, okay, this person is researching my product on G2. So it's safe to say that they're probably somewhat interested in buying some kind of, whatever you are, data provider, sales engagement software, conversation intelligence tool. But the ones in the blue are the ones that come from marketing. And then the ones in the white are the ones that are scenarios that we basically build for ourselves, where we get no leads from marketing, but we essentially are taking the data from our CRM and we are piping it through to these sequences. How you tie these together. So again, there's 2 different scenarios. The first bucket, or the first type of scenario, is where you have a postbound premise. So they did download content, or they did register for a webinar, or they did attend some kind of event, or they are a high value MQL, or they did go to your website and view, and you've piped them through to a sequence. Any kind of postbound premise. I mean, I would almost ask you guys, if after this session, you watch this session, and I sent you an email and I said, hey, thanks so much for watching the cold email session. Do you want to buy my product? Typically, the person who received, who was sitting through the session would say no. Like, I just came here for the content. I just came here for the session. I didn't necessarily come here to be sold to. So you want to be cognizant of that and view that basically anyone who has a postbound premise, whether that's they downloaded content, they registered for a webinar, etc., that they essentially, you want to mention that for context, but you then want to transition with the words, but more importantly, and you want to talk about them. them. That's all that matters, is what your prospect is doing. When you're selling to someone, you should be, at least from my perspective, getting to know them. Things that they care about, things that, they keep them up at night, things that are relevant to them, things that they're doing, things that they're saying. So it's all about your buyer. It's not about your product and all the wonderful things that you can do and your social proof and your features. It's all about your buyer and what they came in that door to hypothetically buy you for. What pain point do they have? So a great way to start that relationship is basically saying, hi, Scott, I noticed that you downloaded this content, or I noticed that you attended this session on cold emailing. But more importantly, I saw that you wrote this article on LinkedIn where you're talking about scaling effective teams. So you essentially want to make the entire email, whether you have a postbound premise or not, all about them. So you want to mention it for context, transition with, but more importantly, and then transition over to some kind of personalized premise that we reviewed in the first 5 buckets. It's about them in specific, something they did or said. If you don't have any kind of postbound premise, which is a very high, likely option for all of those reps out there who are sitting there wondering like, okay, well, I don't get content downloads, etc. This bucket is for you. So this is a cold outbound bucket. If I have no kind of scenario built or no kind of sequence built for this person, and this is just a person that's within our ABM strategy, for instance, this is just someone that I really want to talk to, then I would say, hi, Scott, reason for my outreach is I noticed you wrote this article on LinkedIn the other day where you're talking about scaling effective teams. One line that stood out to me is that you said it all comes down to conversations, great conversations. So you essentially want to give them the detail of not only did I read your post, or not only did I see your article, or not only did I attend your webinar on cold emailing, but one line that stood out to me, I want to prove it to you that there was something in that piece of outreach that I really, really liked, because then it will give you meat to fuel the rest of the conversation. So I wouldn't even just go to the step of like, oh, they wrote this article, or, oh, they have something about scaling effective teams on their headline. I would give them one piece, one quote, one little thing in specific that stood out to you. And on a side note, this is a great way to get to know the buyer persona of your industry. If you're selling into someone who's a marketer, what a better way to get to know them than to get to know their work, things that they're writing and things that are exciting to them, because it helps you understand at a molecular level, what are the things that really make a marketer tick, and how can I reach out to other marketers in a way that's really thought-provoking and makes them, pull in and want to engage. So again, in review, if you have a postbound premise on the former slides, so basically content downloads of any of these in list, I would mention for bucket 1, I would mention it, I would transition with, but more importantly, and I would give them a personalized, some kind of personalized summary. If you don't have any kind of postbound premise, meaning this is just a cold email, then you're going to say, I saw you wrote this article on LinkedIn, or one of the first 5 buckets, one line that stood out to me, and you're going to do some kind of excerpt to really drill it home for your prospect. So now we know how to pick out a personalized premise, but what the crap do we do with the rest of the email? How do we maintain consistency? How do we make sure that all of my reps are kind of on the same page and that they're all saying the same types of things, but that they still have the room to be creative and be them on the phone? I think one of the biggest things that I've seen people struggle with in the industry is sales science or is it art? Which one of those buckets does it really fit into? And should I personalize or should I just be relevant and unpersonalize? Quick tip, I have seen quite a bit on social media and people talking a lot about personalization. And a lot of times they'll attribute a personalized message to one that's not relevant. So I am here today to say that both of those are necessary for your email to resonate. If you have an email that's personalized without being relevant, your buyer will like you because they're like, oh, they know who I am, but then they won't buy from you because they don't think that you can help them in their day-to-day. Whereas if they get a message that's relevant without personalization, you'll get some buyers, a couple people who respond, I want to go to Vegas, and then I see this push notification of like trips to Vegas that are cheap. You'll get some buyers, but they won't think that you're really different. And the biggest way, in my experience, again, just to sell is to sell with integrity, build rapport with your buyer, and do that by knowing exactly who they are. And one of the mechanisms or levers that you can pull is personalization to communicate to your buyer like, hey, I'm different than 99.9% of other reps because I know something about you. That doesn't mean that you should buy my product, but it does put me in the right realm of like, I think the CMO of Lyft said it the best whenever he was on LinkedIn at one point, and he said, if you want 15 minutes of my time, give me 5 of yours first by knowing who I am and researching me. So Within the structure of an email, we want to make sure that we still maintain consistency among my reps. So a lot of teams say like, hey, personalization is great, but how do I essentially, one of the biggest problems that I have with it is how do I know that all of my, younger reps or people who don't know my company or haven't sold, my product for a long time, who are new to the organization, how do I make sure that they know what they're talking about? And how do I make sure that they're within buyer persona? And how do I make sure that they, essentially can personalize, but also are within some kind of boundary of our branding and messages that we want to be communicating? So for this, I defer to what I call Chuck Jones theory for structuring an email. Chuck Jones, for anyone who's watching, he is the father of the rules of animation. So essentially, Chuck Jones, think Looney Tunes, think Wile E. Coyote, and think the Roadrunner. But essentially, Chuck Jones was the creator of the rules of animation within Acme. And when Chuck Jones was little, I remember I was reading actually pretty in depth about his father when he was growing up. And his father was a infamous, notoriously terrible businessman. He would even say it himself on record. And his father, every single time he got hired at a company, he would get pencils and he would get pens that had basically the name of the company notched into both. So it'd say on the letterhead, he would put the company name, and then he'd put the company name on his pens and pencils for the new organization out of excitement that he was working with. And then every time he got let go, he would give them to Chuck Jones and he would say, hey, I need you to use these up. Use them up in any way possible that you can. So when he was little, Chuck Jones started drawing with them. That was the first thing that came to his head. So he drew and drew and drew and drew and drew different characters, animals, things that he saw, that were laying around the house and different pictures and things within his viewpoint. And he is attributed with drawing up to 200,000 drawings in his lifetime. And after about 100,000 drawings, he said that instead of thinking about the actual drawing, he started thinking about the rules behind the picture that he was creating. So a great example is, if I was going to turn an animal into a character, it should look like this. Or if I'm going to, make a head of a character, it's going to look like this, or a beak should be this long. But he essentially started governing how he was drawing. He was structuring it in terms of scale of like, these are the 5 principles of what I'm going to do for any kind of drawing. And these are the pillars and the tenets of which I'm going to marry myself to when it comes to being, an artist and creating these characters. So when it came to Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, he knew, just as I know, just as I hope most leaders out there know, that I am not the genesis of all creative thought. I am a tiny, tiny, tiny blip in the bucket, okay? I'm one drop in the bucket. And so instead of wanting to control my reps and saying like, hey, you need to send this message, I wanted to unleash all of the creative, wonderful thoughts that they had, but still maintain them within structure. So when it comes to Wile E. Coyote, for instance, Chuck Jones knew that he wasn't the genesis of all creative thought, so he knew he needed other writers, but he wanted to keep them within certain bounds. So he created the 9 rules of Wile E. Coyote. And you can go look them up online, at a later session or a later time, hopefully after the session. But essentially, the 9 rules were rules that he was giving to these writers to say, hey, I want you to stay within these boundaries and these rules. But as far as how you create the episode, like, do whatever you want. Be as creative as you want, but you need to maintain within these rules. So a great example of one of those rules, well, I'll give you 2, but one example is that a Wile E. Coyote should always be more embarrassed than he is harmed. And another rule that stood out to me was that make gravity Wile E. Coyote's biggest enemy. So when I start thinking about Wile E. Coyote and that Roadrunner series, the first thing that I think about is Wile E. Coyote running off of a cliff, and then 3 seconds later he drops because of gravity. So gravity was his biggest enemy, and those writers were always trying to nail that home every single episode. So when it comes to writing these emails, you might be thinking, how does this fit in? when it comes to writing emails, I want to harness the creative mindset of my team. I want to hire really smart people that are creative and who want to push the nozzle on everything that's going on within, creative writing and prospecting. And I want to maintain a little bit of structure with them, but I also want to harness that deep down creative energy and make sure that they are feeling empowered enough to come up with these premises. And I will say that something that was shocking to me whenever I'm seeing these reps deploy these messages is when I started to do that as opposed to give them buyer persona templates, they, number one, had a lot more ownership over their work because they were being much more creative and they weren't just a button pusher. But number two, I have seen some of the most creative angles come from these reps that had these amazing ideas. I'll never forget this one email where basically a rep at Chorus likened, he said, he reached out to a prospect and said, hey, I noticed that you are a premier gardener. When it comes to good gardening, it's all about pruning away, the parts of the plant that the plant doesn't need and that you need to remove to make it survive. What if you could remove the negative parts of a sales conversation that your rep is saying that's preventing them from hitting more quota? And I just got goosebumps even thinking about it. Like, it was such a creative angle, but I did want to give my rep some kind of rules. So as far as the rules for the structure of an email, they go like this, at least for me. There are 4 lines in an email, absolute max 4. But really 3 is where you want to write, but anywhere from 3 to 4 lines in an email. And essentially what you want to do to your prospect is you want to stand out right off the bat. So Google did a study on the way that you read emails on desktop. And how you read emails is this. You start at 2 o'clock in the email. So basically the end of the first line, and then you start to go clockwise. So what that tells you about how your prospects are going to be reading your emails is that they're going to read the end of the first line first. They're then going to loop around to the end of the last line. They're then going to loop around to the beginning of the last line. And they're going to finish in this middle section, which is typically going to be your value prop. So what that tells you about how your prospect is reading your emails, that essentially they want to know who you are, and they want to know what you want before they want to know anything about what your product does. So mostly when I see sales teams they're laboring over what is the perfect buyer persona pitch, or what is the perfect way to say this thing about what our product does so that our buyer, will really be interested in this game. And the reality is your buyer is much more interested with who you are and what you want other than they are, what your product does. So the most valuable real estate is going to be who you are, second, what you want, and then you communicating your value prop is predicated on nailing those first 2 buckets. So the first line I typically do is going to be the premise, and it's going to be the longest line of the email. So this is going to be the reason that you're reaching out. So instead of talking about, hello, my name is Beck, and I am the number 1 data provider, and I sell Verizon wireless software, work for Oracle or whatever. Instead of talking about me and who I am, I want to talk about my prospect from the jump. So I essentially want to diffuse them with knowing who they are right off the bat. So I would say, again, this is going to be the longest line. So you're going to say, the reason for my outreach is I saw that you wrote this article on LinkedIn where you're talking about scaling effective teams. One line that stood out to me was, it all comes down to great conversations. The second line of the email should be the medium length, and this should be all about your value prop with, again, it's going to be mapped back up to the reason for your outreach. So be very, very careful of 10-80-10, but essentially here you want to communicate, how that first line, how the reason for your outreach relates into what your product does. So I'm going to go into that in a later session, that you can already see live in season 2, that will be out in a couple of weeks. But essentially, where I go into how you can hook personalization to relevance. But essentially, this middle line should be medium length line, not as big as your first line, because that one was about your prospect. But you should be relating this personalized line back to what you do as a company. The third line is going to be what we call a CTA in the industry, but essentially this is short for call to action. And this is where you request one time to unpack the above agenda that you covered in your email. So this is essentially one time where you say like Wednesday at 3, if you give me a shot Wednesday at 3 to unpack how VPs of sales leverage, this software to drive more quota attainment, I promise we could part ways as friends if you're not impressed. Or I promise I won't jam up your inbox with follow-up if I strike out. But essentially you want to create some kind of non-pressure barter with your prospect that if they give you 30 minutes, you won't be the typical rep that just chases them down if they don't think that it's a fit. But essentially this should be your shortest line as your CTA, where you're talking about, again, that you just want one time to unpack whatever it is that you covered in the agenda above. And then the last line to the email, I typically do deploy what I call the push-pull technique. The push-pull technique is basically you backing off from your prospect in the last line and communicating to them that either way, in any case, no matter what, you're a fan of them and that you really liked this content. One thing that your prospect might be worried about is that you complimented their content only to get the sale. So I'll tell you a little bit of a story. I am home in Texas for all of this filming. I'm from the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and I am staying with my family. And my mom and dad have a dog named Snowball. And every single night before I go to bed, I cook egg whites and I eat egg whites. And so I noticed after like the first or second day, Snowball started to get wise and say like, oh, okay, every night at 11:30 p.m. she cooks egg whites. And so she started coming up the stairs and just waiting there, for the plate. And I was like, okay, she wants the plate. She wants to lick the plate. Like that's what, what dogs do. So I'd give her the plate every night, after I ate the egg whites. There was one night that stood out to me that she was sitting at the end of my bed after she had licked the plate and she was just staring at me. And I'm like, what is this dog staring at? Like, what does she want? So I looked down to check that the plate, was that she had already cleared it. And sure enough, she had already cleared it. So I looked at her, confused of what she want. And then I realized that she wanted to come up in the bed and she wanted to snuggle with me. So I welcomed her up and I said, Snowball, come here, like come in the bed. And she jumps up in the bed and we sat there and snuggled. And it changed my view of her. I realized in that moment that regardless of whether I gave her this egg plate or not, Snowball still wanted to spend time with me. And so it made me want to give her that egg plate even more. You want to do the same thing with your prospects. You don't want to compliment their work just so you can get something. And you want to communicate it to them in either way, in any case scenario, whether they give you what you want or not, whether they respond to your email, whether they take the meeting, whether they buy the product, whether they X, Y, and Z, all of the agenda that you have, you want to communicate to them that either way, whether they do that or they don't do that, you really valued their work. And make this be genuine. I hope that it is genuine to anyone who's selling out there of like either way, keep the good articles coming, hope that you're staying safe with everything going on in the world and such a big fan of your team. But basically this is going to be an outro where you're giving your prospect reprieve that in the last line, it's not such a high pressure situation. Like regardless of whether they take the meeting Wednesday at 2, regardless of whether they look into what your product is, that either way, you're still a big fan of theirs because it makes it easier on your prospect to believe that you're after their best interests because you're after their best interests from the start. So this is called the push-pull technique. It is basically a gravitation towards balance within your email that you want to be iron fist within a velvet glove. You don't want to soft CTA and say like, is this relevant? You want to say, I want this thing. Let me be very clear. I don't want to confuse you. I want a meeting with you Wednesday at 2 based on this personalized premise, meaning based on this thing that you said that I think might make it relevant to you. However, if you don't meet with me, it's okay. It's no pressure. And I'm so glad that you wrote that article. Keep the good stuff coming. So in review, you've got 3 or 4 lines to an email. You've got the personalized premise. That's going to be line 1 in the longest line. You've got the body and value prop that's going to be hooked into the personalization that should be medium length. You've got the CTA, which is going to be you requesting one time to reach out, to unpack the agenda of whatever you talked about above in the email. And then you've got the push-pull technique, which is my favorite on the back end, where you basically tell your prospect that either way, that you're a big fan of their team. So now we know the structure of the email and we know how to pick out a premise. But that still leaves us with the million-dollar question of how do I maintain consistency for my reps if they are new to the organization or if they don't essentially know my value prop? How do I maintain some level of infrastructure, and how do I maintain some level of consistency in terms of messaging? To do this, I created 2 lists for my reps whenever I started personalizing at scale. The first list that I created was 7 pillars of attractive messaging, of like, these are all the flavors that I really, really want reps to be talking about, thinking about, saying, etc., and considering whenever they're sending over an email. And then here's a list of all the things that I never want them to say. So let's start being very pro encouragement. Let's start with the 7 pillars of attractive messaging of what I wanted my reps to value. Full disclosure, I am almost less interested that people follow my 7 pillars. So whoever it is that's watching this, if you're sitting there, in your chair, you have probably, most likely, 95% chance have sold into or are currently selling into much different buyer personas that I have with a different value prop. So I certainly don't have the temerity to tell anyone what to do. So I would say the seven pillars that I have teased out are the things that are very, very important to me as someone who loves messaging and studies messaging and is a big fan of the game. However, I'm more so interested that you walk away with, okay, I need to have 7 pillars of things that I value in email, and that I coach my reps against and that I coach myself against. But as far as what the pillars exactly are for you, I'm less interested in you maintaining to that structure the 7 pillars of what mine are. But I will start with the pillar number 1, which is the one that I see done the least well in the industry, typically within cold outreach. And then I'm going to go down to number 7, which I see done the most well within outreach. So let's start with number 1. Number 1 is going to be prospect-centric. Sounds pretty easy in theory, pretty hard to do in practice, but make every single word that you write to your prospect be about your prospect. Period. So even if you're giving social proof, instead of saying, I work with LinkedIn, say I work with companies like you in terms of size, for example, LinkedIn. So you always want to couch for your prospect when you're saying something to them, when you're communicating in that very valuable real estate, when you have that 2-second shot to get a hold of them or get some of their attention, you want to communicate to them all in terms of them. The reason for your outreach is them. What if they could do this in their role? Give me a shot to unpack for you how da-da-da-da. And then either way, I love your content. But basically, you want every single word to be about your prospect, not about your company. I will share a secret that I haven't shared very often. I would say in the realm of 90 to 95% of the messages that I have had reps send and that I have sent myself do not include my company name, right? So the rules of the game, people don't care what company you work for. People don't care about your social proof. They don't care about all your awesome case studies, as regardless of how great they are. They care about what are they running into in their role, in their day-to-day, what pains are they seeing, and how can they do their job better? So if you can communicate that value prop, we can worry about the company name later. And the minute that you bring up your company name, your prospects start seeing you as a salesperson. So I have gotten away with not even including my company name. It's in the signature. Everyone can scroll down and see who you work for and where your website is and your phone number. But what you can't get back is that first impression that you're leaving with your prospect. So number 1, above all, be all about your prospect and the things that they're running into in their day-to-day outside of you. Number 2 is being pain-centric over pleasure-centric. I will tell a quick story. So I essentially, at one point, I was hospitalized because I had 1st, 2nd, and 3rd degree burns from the waist down. Kind of a long story. But essentially in that moment, if someone had walked up to me and said, okay, Beck, we'll give you, we have $5,000, we'll give you 1 of 2 things. You can use it to buy 1 of 2 things. Either number 1, you can spend it on a trip to Tahiti after you're all better with this burn. Or number 2, we can spend it on a pill that will take all of your pain away on this hospital bed. Which one do you think I would have picked? The answer for me, and for most of your prospects, would be the latter, is the pill. It's give me the pill, give me the pill, give me the pill. Take away this pain of what I'm running into, and how can you alleviate this pressure. So, being from Texas, I actually do ride horses, and how you train horses is essentially you don't give them treats, but by the release of pressure is how you reward them. So basically you discipline them in the moment, but the smarter the animal, humans included, they enjoy the release of pressure more than anything else. So the best feeling, at least from my view and what I've studied from psychology, is relief. It's not pleasure, it's relief from something. Think about whenever you think you've lost your cell phone and you go for an hour thinking that you lost your cell phone at some gas station, and then all of a sudden you dig down into your bag or dig down into the console and you find your cell phone, and think about how that feels in that moment, that you are so relieved above all that you don't have to go out and buy a new cell phone. So you want to talk to your prospects. If they are in business, they are in pain. There is some kind of pain for them in terms of their role. Something that they run into, something that they can't do quickly, and there are varying levels of pain, right? Scale of 1 to 10, some of them are a 2, they probably won't buy it at 2. Once they get to a 7, 8, 9, or 10, okay, I got to do something about this because it matters to me enough. But you always want to be communicating to your prospect in terms of the pain that they're running into in their day-to-day and how you relieve that without mentioning your product, but like how you could relieve that, in some case scenario. The third pillar is my favorite pillar. It is pride aversive. So if we were to role play for a second, most people, I would almost dare to say all people, don't like pride in another person because we all have it. People don't like pride because we all have pride, right? So think about when you hear someone talk constantly about themselves. I'm awesome, I'm number one, look at all the amazing things that I've done, let me post on social media all these great things, on and on and on. That actually has a reverse backfire effect in you from the psychological perspective. So when someone talks super well about themselves and says, these are all the great things that I've done, and I'm awesome, and I've raised all this money, and I have all this money, and my romantic life is going great, and I'm just swiping right or left or whatever, turning down bouquets of flowers and et cetera, and my family's great and we're awesome and we have everything together. The first thing that the person who's listening to you thinks is that person is really into themselves, and I want to find the hole. I want to find the hole of something that isn't awesome or that they don't do well. Whereas if you go on the reverse side, if someone trips in front of you, the first thing that you typically want to do is to help them. You want to pick them up. So whatever you tell your prospects or tell humanity in general, typically the rule of thumb is they want to rebel against it in the ego state. So if I tell them I'm awesome, they want to take me down. If I tell them we don't, here are a couple things of very accountable humility of things that we don't do well, the first thing they want to do is say, oh, you're not that bad, and this part was actually pretty good. So when you're talking to your prospects, there's 2 types of pride aversion that you can do. You can either do number 1, passive submission, where you are a fan of your prospect. So you know something about them, something they said. Basically, you should walk into any kind of meeting knowing a TLDR-like resume of who your prospect is, and you want to fan out about what they've done. Essentially, if you're running into, if some company is paying you a lot of money just to get a meeting with someone, that someone is probably pretty impressive. They probably have been in the industry for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and they have earned the respect that you should dole out to them whenever you're prospecting into them. So if you're coming across your prospect, I remember there was this one time where I walked into a dinner and there was a sales leader over at Pandora. And I walked into this dinner and he said, hey, you're back. I think we're connected on LinkedIn. And I said, I think I've been following you for 3 years. Let me give you the top 5 reasons of why I think that Pandora should overthrow Spotify. On and on and on and on. I go on this list of things that he had done, things that Pandora, moves that they had made. But essentially, I was fanning out about him. And in doing so, you make the game all about your prospect and you make it much less about yourself. So, the first part is passive submission, but the second piece of pride aversion is being proactively humble. A lot of feigned humility out there. So you want to make sure you're very, very genuine in this. But essentially, if you are accountable to your prospect and you tell them in a non-overarching way some things that you have done that haven't warranted their time, where you weren't successful, it will make them draw towards you. So I'll give you an example. By way of example, I remember there was a rep who was calling into Oracle, if anyone from Oracle who is sitting out there watching this video. And I was watching him make this phone call. So the prospect picks up the phone. He was a director of sales, and this rep starts, let's call him Chris. He starts going, just on and on and on and on and on, talking super quickly, feature dumping. I mean, I thought the guy was going to pass out in the middle of it, just because he was going on and on and on about all the amazing things that we did. And the prospect, finally, it was actually relieving to me, hung up on him, because he was talking too much. The rep turns to me and I said, if you had to guess, why do you think that prospect hung up the phone? And he goes, I don't know, I blacked out. I think that I feature dumped, somewhere in there. Like, I think I mentioned our tool 50 times. I don't know if I was on buyer persona. I said, I want you to do me a favor. I want you to call that prospect back, and I want you to tell him that. And I'm like, very, very quickly, why do you think that you started feature dumping like that? And he said, well, I didn't expect for my prospect to pick up the phone. We make dials all day long, and we only get 3 to 4 connects a day. So when he picked up the phone, it surprised me, and it unraveled from there. I said, tell him that too. Tell him that when he picked up the phone, it surprised you because you hadn't heard from any of your prospects all day, and that you started feature dumping, and that you went way too much into your product, and that given his permission, and that everything unraveled from there. And then I want you to stop talking and see what the prospect says. He says, I can't do that. I can't call this person back. And I said, I said, just trust me this once. Go ahead and make the phone call, and I'll pay you $20 if this doesn't lead to a compelling conversation. He calls him back. He tells him the story. His prospect opens up to him, and he books the meeting. Same rep, same value prop, just a little bit of accountability in there. So to anyone who's watching, myself extremely included, we mess up. We say things that are off buyer persona, that aren't necessarily relevant. Maybe we talk too much, maybe we say too little, maybe, we gave our prospect whatever. Made some promise we couldn't keep, made some promise we know we couldn't keep whenever we made it. Like, we mess up. And so I think something that's really, really attractive whenever you're messaging to someone, a way that you can make them see you as less of a seller and more of a human, is by, again, don't overshoot it. Don't just talk about all, don't go all Eeyore on them and talk about all the terrible things, that you've done in your lifetime. But I think sprinkling in a little of accountability of like, hey, reason for my outreach is I was reading an article the other day about how to be relevant to your buyer relevant to your buyer, and I was convicted about the message that I sent to you. Take the accountability for why your prospects aren't responding. Our prospects aren't responding. The most typical response that we get from our prospect is no response. And they're not responding because they're bad people. They're not responding because, they're out to get you or because they're malevolent. They're not responding because we simply weren't relevant enough, and we didn't say the right thing to get them and provoke them to want to respond. So taking a little bit of accountability in that and saying like, hey, reason for my outreach is I must have missed the mark. Or did I mess something up? Or did I overstep my bounds? Or did I say something, or it seems like it's just not the best time to connect, or maybe I just didn't hit home. I think taking a little bit of accountability in there can go a long way. So let's talk about pillar 4. Pillar 4 is going to be fluidity, probably the hardest pillar to nail. Fluidity means simply connecting your premise to your value prop, to your CTA, and to your push-pull line. So again, really easy to do mentally or in our heads in theory, really, really difficult to do in practice. So kind of a quick tip here is if you are struggling with fluidity, if you are rereading your email that you're about to send to someone and it doesn't make sense from like the 12-year-old perspective of like, I wouldn't understand this if I was just taking a first glance and I didn't know what we did, then you are probably multi-value propping and saying we do these 3 things. I would challenge you to basically pick one value prop and say like, we do this one thing, or what if you could make this thing faster? and then save the later value props for the subsequent emails. But essentially pick one value prop with one premise and nail it home. And if that doesn't work, then go on to the second email where you pick a different personalized premise and the different associated value prop. Pillar 5, I think we've talked a lot about this, but basically, think about what your buyer does in their day-to-day. For instance, a lot of companies that I've sold into, they've had very, very similar roles that we sold into that sound similar, but are very, very different in practice. Great example is sales and sales development. Both have the word sales, very, very different roles. One is completely closing and a little self-prospecting, hopefully more, a little more for teams. But sales development is all about just setting the appointment and then passing on the appointment on to an account executive. So in terms of relevance, what we care about, if you're going to talk to me about as a sales development leader, you want to talk about how you can help me book more meetings. If you're going to talk to me about being a sales leader, it's all about more quota attainment. So your buyers can tell if you know what their role is. So I would say, get to know your buyers very, very well. Over knowing your product, I would know my buyer. But you want to make sure that the words that you're saying are very, very relevant to them. Number 6 is going to be brevity. I probably don't do a great example or do a great job of this. Typically, if you were to ever meet me in person, be so lucky. But never use 7 words when 4 words will do. Pillar 7, noticeability. This is all about your subject line. I'm going to do a later follow-up session on how to do subject lines to boost response rates, essentially. But noticeability, the goal of a subject line is to get an email open without the prospect feeling bait and switch in the middle of an email. One of the most viral email campaigns that I have seen is basically there was in the subject line a terrible subject line that said pictures of your wife cheating on you. And in the subject of the email, it was a weight loss campaign saying if you don't lose weight, then your wife is going to cheat on you. So it was 100% open rate, and the email responses were viral, but it was people who were super upset because they felt bait and switch. So if your whole job is predicated on building rapport with your buyer, building rapport and striking that up out of thin air with someone that you don't know, the quickest way to eradicate that is basically by getting them to open an email and feel dumb for opening the email because it has nothing to do with the subject line. So I'll give you a quick example and then we can move on to the 7 deadly sins and wrap up. But I remember my first week as an SDR, I was selling attribution software, and part of that was a fraud suite where you could prevent mobile apps from acquiring fraudulent users. And I thought, I have this great idea. I'm going to write a subject line that says, it's not your fault. And in the email, I'm going to talk all about this fraud suite and say how fraudulent users being acquired is not your fault. And I'm like, everyone will open that email. And so I'm going to get so many responses is what I thought. So I kicked this email out to 1,235 people I sent this email to. The first hour, I get a response. I'll never forget it. My first week as an SDR, I get a response from a prospect that basically said, the subject line of this email makes me hate your company before even getting to know you. Speaking of fraud, please do not send emails like this to anyone else if you want to stay in this industry. He CC'd in my CRO at the time, and he CC'd in my CEO at the time on the first week in the job. And I took that as a very, very deep lesson of he was right. He opened this email because I gave this great subject line that got the email open, but it shattered the rapport with that prospect then and for good, and very publicly in front of my CRO and new CEO first week on the job. So you always want to make sure that the subject line that you're delivering to your prospect has the integrity and stands the test of it is correlative to the messaging within the email so that you don't lose that respect with your buyer right off the bat. So let's finish with bucket number 4, and then I will let you guys go. But basically, the 7 deadly sins of messaging is just a list of messaging habits and email habits that I have kept my reps away from in the past when I've been running teams because it prevents my prospects from responding. So let's start with the top. Number one, being too casual or too silly. I see a lot of this in the industry, and there's a few examples here below, but basically sending over any gifts to your prospects, starting the email with hey instead of hi, or giving them number three, the dreaded list that I've seen in the industry of like, hey, you must be off on an island somewhere or swallowed by a shark, or you simply just don't value data and don't give a credit about your company. But basically the goal, and I feel this within SDRs and self-prospecting AEs, we want to shatter through the buyer-seller mentality and basically, be different in front of our prospects. So I would always caution people to be different, but don't be too silly. Like, you want to stand out, but you also don't want to stand out for the wrong reasons, essentially. So if I were to have a meeting with former President Barack Obama, and that meeting was scheduled at 2, I would probably be at the White House or wherever he was going to meet me at 1, right? I respect him. And so I want to show up beforehand, and I want to say like, hey, as a piece of that respect, I want to make sure that I treat you accordingly. And I probably wouldn't be very loose in my conversation. I would be, different, hopefully, but formal, with him to some regard, because I want to communicate to this buyer like, hey, I don't know you and you don't know me. So I've had a couple of prospects, people who are prospecting into me, call me dude before on the phone, and like, the answer was a no, regardless of whatever they were asking. So you want to make sure that you hold your prospects in high esteem and be very different with them. You don't have to be super buttoned up all the time, but you always want to lead with respect to your prospects. So metaphorically hold the door open for them and avoid this list. Number 2 is going to be wasted text. This is extremely prevalent in the industry. I would say the majority of emails that I see have some kind of wasted text, and we all know what the wasted text is because we all send it. Great couple of examples here. I know you're busy, but just want to follow back, just want to circle back, just want to bubble this to the top of your inbox. I'd love to. Happy Monday. Hope you and your family are doing safe. Hope you and your kids are okay during, the pandemic that's going on. But basically, all of this is going to basically waste, number one, waste the most valuable real estate within the email to your buyer. And number 2, it's of zero value. But number 3, and the worst piece of it, or one of the worst pieces of it, is it causes pattern recognition in your buyer. So these are very, very typical intros. Most salespeople do them. And so you want to get your buyer out of that, again, toxic buyer-seller mentality where they only see you as a salesperson. Because typically people don't trust salespeople. So you want to build some kind of rapport by talking about something different. So good rule of thumb, if you could strike through the messaging and not lose any content within the messaging and not any substance or pith, if you will, then you want to go ahead and do that. Number 3 is going to be being the authority over the prospect, telling someone to let you know, leading with their first name only, as opposed to, on one hand you have... one hand you have, hey, Scott, and then on the other hand, you have just Scott with a comma. So when people send me an email where it just says Beck, comma, I'm like, is this the IRS? Like, I'm in trouble. So a good happy medium is going to be high. But essentially for, the sin number 3, you don't want to ever talk to a super authoritative voice to your prospect. You have 3 ego states in your body. You have child ego state, you have parent ego state, and you have adult ego state. Child ego state or parent ego state is comprised of 2 ego states, controlling and nurturing. So controlling, think of a parent who enforces curfews. Nurturing, think of someone who nurtures someone, to fall asleep. And then within child ego state, you have 2 ego states. You have natural, think, impressed by very little, likes bubbles, purchases, and roller coasters. And then you have adaptive, which is basically the rebellious side of your nature. So these ego states are present in every single person that exists. So if you tell your prospect to let you know something, you're commanding them to do something. So you're in parent controlling ego state, which triggers in them child adaptive, which makes them like instantly want to rebel against whatever you're saying. So think of the example. If I say, do not push this button, the first thing everyone wants to do is push the button because they're in child adaptive ego state. So you want to be very careful about commanding someone who does not answer to you and who you have no authority over and who you want a response back from to do something, because it inherently triggers them into child adaptive ego state and makes them innately not want to respond. Number 4 is going to be questioning the prospect's authority. I've had people say, are you the decision maker? Or I guess you're not the right person to talk to. If you are after wondering if someone's the decision maker, if I ask someone who is the decision maker, if they're the decision maker, they basically think, yeah, but so what? Like, is that the only reason that you're talking to me? If I ask someone who's not the decision maker, are you the decision maker? Then they are either A, gonna, fib the truth and not tell you the complete truth, or, B, the worst case scenario is you just disempowered someone that you could have leverage within an organization. So I know that we're all after, is this person the person that signs on the dotted line? Is this person someone who could get the deal approved, etc.? But you're not going to get the real information you're after. And in both case scenarios, whether they are the decision or aren't the decision maker, you're going to turn them off as a prospect. Number 5, making your prospect feel not okay. So a couple of examples here, number 1 of not taking accountability and saying, I've emailed you 7 times, but you haven't responded. I see this in a lot of breakup emails, or mudslinging against your competitors. I'll sum it up with this. What Sarah says about Sally says more about Sarah than Sally. So if I, for instance, my great friend Dan Smith over at Winning by Design, if I say, hey Dan, or Dan's awful, Dan's not great, he's really not good, etc., etc. These are all the messed up things he's done. There are none, by the way, on the record. But if I were to say that, then essentially that looks poorly on me, not Dan. So when we're talking about our competitors, everyone has competitors. Everyone typically doesn't like them. But you want to make sure that you don't mudsling and say all the terrible things about them. At least if you think them, not to say them. Because it reflects on your character, not your competitors. 6, glorifying yourself. I can be pretty short here because I feel like we've hit it home here, but saying you're the number one, we're the best, etc., or giving social proof where you're the hero as opposed to the customers who use you. But you essentially want to stay away from giving any glory to yourself and talking about how great you are. And then the last sin that you want to stay away from is making your prospect feel stupid. This is a very common one of saying, do you know what we do? Or does that make sense? So I know that we're after comprehension. So a great kind of quick tip of how to ask for comprehension is basically say, am I making any sense? Over does that make sense? Because it puts onus on you to communicate versus them to comprehend. So it's a good way to do that. So in summary, I know that cold emails are tough. It's a really, really tough role. And being a prospector, especially in today's day and age, is just a really, really tough role. Our prospects want more from us. They want more from us than ever before. They want us to be relevant. They want us to know who they are. But what I think that is that's a wonderful opportunity for us. It's an opportunity to lead with character, to do our research, to say something that they won't ever forget. And so I think the crux of that is by researching your buyer and knowing who they are. So in summary, I know that cold emailing is tough. Prospecting is one of the most difficult functions within an organization, and our prospects have simply raised the bar. But I think that presents us a great opportunity, an opportunity to focus on our core craft and learn how to email in a way that has never been done before. So that's it. Thanks everyone so much for watching the session. If you want to see other sessions that are like this on sales topics, go to flipthescript.co and you can log in and see all the content that I have available. And if you want to see some juicy TMZ updates on what's going on with Flip the Script, go to Flip the Script on LinkedIn and be sure to give us a follow.